Welcome to 10th or Tuesday, episode number 11. My name is Michael Boldin, along with
Michael Maharrey.
So in the last 2 weeks, we skipped an episode last week, unfortunately, but we've had a ton of wins for the nullification movement, at least from my count so far. It might be higher than that. We've had more than 24 bills to advance liberty in the states move forward at various stages. One of them that I want to talk about, since it made so much news with the president kind of denouncing these efforts recently, is asset forfeiture. This is where basically, and we've talked about this and covered this quite a bit in other areas on the site, where a piece of property is in essence charged with a crime, and police take it, and then they partner with the federal government and things like this. It's bad news, basically. But a bill in Arizona which would reform the state's civil asset forfeiture laws and then close the federal equitable sharing loophole, which allows them to get around any state restrictions, passed the state house by 60-0, Mike. That never happens in Arizona.
No, I was really surprised when I saw that vote total. Especially, it's Arizona's very aggressive, shall we say, their police law enforcement lobby.
Yes, one of the strongest in the country. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So to see a bill passed by unanimous vote like that, and it's a pretty substantial reform of the asset forfeiture laws there in Arizona, and to see it passed by that number was surprising. Now we got to get through the Senate, and the folks I know over there in the activist community say it's going to be an uphill battle in the Senate,
certainly
just like it was in the House. But very, very encouraging to see that pass, especially with that number of votes.
And one of the first states that actually, if not the first, that actually took on both state and federal asset forfeiture programs was New Mexico. Now, Mike, you've been doing some reporting on this, and they actually passed a very good bill. And I think what we're seeing since then is some of the local police departments and law enforcement organizations there, not all of them, at least my understanding, some of them are trying to find loopholes in this and still use civil asset forfeiture in violation of state law. I think this is, and you can give us a little better explanation of what's happening, but it's a great example. You and I were talking about this before we started the show today, that you just can't just pass some state law and just be done with it. I think that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically what's happened in New Mexico, like you said, they passed very, very strong forfeiture reform, and several cities in New Mexico have their own local asset forfeiture programs, and Albuquerque is the one that's been most reported on. And it's tied to drunk driving laws. And so basically they take away your car, or whoever's car you happen to be driving, if they catch you doing the drunk driving thing. And the state came along and said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do this. This violates state law. And what they did was the city attorneys, they dug into the verbiage of the law and basically found some legal language loopholes that they say allows them to operate local asset forfeiture programs because they're not state programs. And it was just some I even hesitate to say it was poorly worded. It was just
they're always looking. They're always going to look.
Loopholes.
They're always going to look for a loophole. So they're actually moving a bill or working on a bill to close that additional local. So they've already closed, in most situations, the federal loophole. Now they're going to work to close the local loophole. What happened? I know you just filed a report on that yesterday.
It's a multi-million-dollar asset forfeiture program at the local level. So definitely something that needs to be shut down. And it has the same problem as the state and the federal. There's no real due process. It's a big cash cow for these cities. So it's good to see this moving forward.
So a number of states are actually taking action on this. We've seen bills pass in now New Mexico, California, Ohio, and Nebraska, for example. But it is important to stay on top of it to make sure that people aren't getting ripped off anyways.
Right.
That's the essential part. And we actually did a video about this. When you rely only on state governments to stop bad programs, often being done by state governments, it's a losing battle. So you can't. Right. It's a tool. Using these nullification bills is a tool. It's a piece of a larger puzzle. And kudos to those people in New Mexico for staying on top of it rather than just resting on their laurels and letting it ride. Moving over to surveillance, there are a number of bills that move forward on surveillance. Prominently in your state, Mike, Who would have guessed? Because for years, I don't know how to say her name, Representative Diane St. Ange.
St. Ange. St. Ange.
She has filed a bill to restrict surveillance by drones to requiring a warrant based on probable cause. Yeah, that's standard old constitutional kind of stuff.
Sure.
And it always would die in committee. And sometimes, from my understanding, it wouldn't even get a hearing. Now, this year, it got out of committee and then passed 99-0 in the State House last week. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so this is your standard drone bill, nothing special. But like you said, I want to say this is the 4th or 5th year that she's introduced this bill. And like you said, it's never gotten any traction. And this is a good example of how partisan politics plays a role in these state legislatures. Kentucky had a split legislature up until this year. It had a Republican Senate and Democrat House. St. Ange is a Republican. So she would introduce this bill, and it would go to the committee that was run by a Democrat, and he would kill the bill, basically because she's a Republican running a bill in a Democrat majority chamber. So now it's switched over. This last year, you've got Republican majorities in both houses, and whoa! All of a sudden, this bill that couldn't get out of committee is a 99-0 winner. So I have a feeling it's going to go ahead and pass in the Senate as well, and that'll be good. We'll have some basic warrant protections for drone surveillance here in the Bluegrass State.
One of the important things, and we've talked about this in regards to stingrays, for example, one of the important reasons to restrict the local surveillance and the state-level surveillance is because through fusion centers and through ISE, information sharing environment, whatever is collected on a state or local level gets sent upstream to the feds. So as long as they're not doing it, then the data isn't being shared with Washington, D.C. and used in other unconstitutional programs. So kudos to Representative St. Ange on her bill that passed in Kentucky. Another bill that moved forward in New Mexico, back to New Mexico, is the Electronic Communication Privacy Act, and that was, I think, a 41-0 vote last week out of the state Senate. And this deals with, Mike, again, just more general data collection, restricting the use of surveillance on a state and local level, and then also specifically the cell site simulators or stingray devices.
Right. So this is kind of a combination bill. It deals with both the stingrays, so basically stealing your data out of the air, and then it also deals with collecting data out of the physical phone, like the police get a hold of your phone or the police go to your service provider. It requires a warrant for all of that. It's a very strong electronic data protection bill. And you were right. That was the vote total was 41-0. So another one that passed unanimously. It's really interesting to me this year to see these privacy bills passing by such large margins. And I don't know if you have any theories as to why all of a sudden it's seems to be a bipartisan major majority kind of thing. But these bills are really moving this year, and that's exciting.
I think once it actually gets out of committee, it's hard to say to your constituents, I voted against a bill that was just going to say we need to have a warrant before we start collecting data. So, it was good to see that one was supported both sides of the aisle. It's a relatively close split there. I think maybe like 25-17 in the New Mexico Senate, but everybody was on board. It was introduced by 2 Democrats there. Senate Bill 61 that passed the New Mexico Senate this last week, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. And then one other bill I wanted to talk about, I think, Mike, this might be your favorite bill and mine on privacy. The Fourth Amendment Protection Act in Vermont was just introduced. I think it's going to have a little bit of an uphill battle there, but it's a really important principle, as we saw if we're talking about what St. Ange did in Kentucky. If you don't file the bill and if you're not willing to keep pushing it year after year, you're never going to get anything done. So it requires some persistence and recognizing that it may take some roadblocks to get through and some hurdles. But the Vermont bill on the Fourth Amendment, tell us a little about that one.
So this is your basic Fourth Amendment Protection Act that restricts and prohibits.
There's nothing basic about these bills.
I use the term basic to mean,
well, we're on the inside. So
right.
I mean,
actually,
what actually would be basic would be some state bill saying that you're not allowed to do blank in your home. I run through,
right.
In all honesty, I know you look at a lot of bills, but I'm looking at 200 to 300 bills a day scrolling through these state legislature websites, and I'm telling you, 99% of them are awful, and they're trying to control people's lives in every way possible. But this is a very unusual and exciting bill. Sorry, I had to call you out on that one, Mike. It's a very exciting basic Fourth Amendment Protection Act. Well, it should be just basic.
You just said basic.
Of course, that's what I did. Yeah, it actually should be basic because everybody should be doing this all the time. So I can appreciate that.
Right, and by basic, I mean our basic
Of
Fourth
course.
Amendment Protection Act, which is not at all basic.
We're not
It's actually
nitpicking.
very radical.
We're
and
not
what
nit-
it does, everybody's sitting there thinking, what in the world does this bill do? This bill prohibits any material support or resources for warrantless federal spying. So
Right.
basically, it's going to withdraw all state support from agencies like the NSA and the FBI when they're engaging in warrantless surveillance activities,
Constantly.
which is a lot. And so we'll be excited to see, how this moves. I did get in contact with the sponsor, and she's interested in talking about how we can move this bill forward.
Yeah.
And so we'll see how it goes. But it's very important, like you said, just to get these bills, continue to get them introduced, continue to push that envelope, continue to let people know, hey, the states don't have to cooperate with this.
Right.
We don't have to cooperate with the spies. This is a legitimate and a powerful tool that states can use to push back against what I have a feeling is going to be a growing surveillance state over the next 4 years.
Indeed. One thing, if you're in communication with the sponsor, I would recommend, if you haven't already, is sending. We have that great PDF that you actually drafted the text for on the anti-commandeering doctrine. It actually is an unbranded PDF that we put out. Some people don't like the idea of some information from 10th Amendment Center. Other people love it, but it shows up pretty high in the Google search results for anybody watching and listening who wants to look that up. It's a really good document to teach people the concept of and that's been backed by the Supreme Court that says, hey, the states do not have to help the federal government carry out these unconstitutional programs. One other issue that I want to cover before we cut out this week, Mike, is sound money. This is becoming more and more important. I think, well, it's always been extremely important, but it's really good to see that the grassroots is catching on, that you don't have to wait for the federal government to cut off its own banking supply, the Federal Reserve, to actually do something about it. So we reported on that bill in Arizona that passed the state house to end capital gains tax, right?
Exactly, yeah. So the long and short of this bill is it is a tax reform of sorts.
Yeah.
And instead of having to pay capital gains taxes on your gold and silver, you won't have to report it at all as far as your tax purposes. And a capital gain, basically, you buy gold at $1,000, you sell it 3 years later at $1,300, you have a $300 capital gain.
Yeah.
In most states, that's taxed. If this bill passes in Arizona, it will no longer be taxed, and it will encourage the sale of gold and silver and its use as money, because capital gains also applies to using it in terms of other types of transactions, which discourages that use. So this encourages the use of gold and silver as money, and will help break that Federal Reserve monopoly. As
we've talked about before, again, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So as long as they're taxing the use of gold and silver in just day-to-day exchanges, then it's less likely that people are going to use it as what it's supposed to be, which is money. The other bill that we're reporting on as well, great report that you put up on the site from J.P. Cortez at Sound Money Defense League, is a report on House Bill 206 in Idaho. Is that doing the same thing as the Arizona bill that you're...
It's exactly the same thing in function. It's a little bit different in its wording because of the different states, but practically speaking, it does the exact same thing.
Yeah, so some essential steps that people should be taking on a state level if they want to support sound money, they want to oppose the monopoly that the Federal Reserve has, how they're destroying the dollar, is work to remove these capital gains taxes on gold and silver in day-to-day transactions, or just, overall. And then, of course, removing sales taxes, which we've seen on some other bills, for example, in Tennessee. So if, and the example, Mike, that you give is, hey, you go to a store to exchange $5 for some gold. I mean, it'd probably be a different number, maybe some silver, and they're going to charge you an 8% tax. Of course, again, this is going to discourage its use, and that's part of how they keep people pushed towards Federal Reserve notes, which are becoming more and more worthless by the day.
Exactly. I like the analogy that J.P. Cortez came up with, that it's like going to the bank and handing them $1, getting 4 quarters, and then they charge you 7 cents for your quarters.
Right. I mean, no one's going to do that,
It's
right?
absurd.
Yeah,
It's
of course.
absurd, right? And that's exactly what is happening with the sale of gold and silver, which, like you said, it cannot be emphasized too much. It is money.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's so important that organizations or companies like United Precious Metals Association in Utah, basically a gold bank or gold depository is what they call it, where you can make transactions electronically using gold and silver. And this is a real important thing. I'm also personally a big supporter of Bitcoin. I think anything outside the current Federal Reserve system, whether you think that's sound money or not, I think just the idea of conducting transactions outside of the government-run and government-controlled system is extremely important.
Yep. Competition is good.
Yeah, indeed. So I guess that'll cut it for us today. Thank you so much for watching here on 10th or Tuesday, episode 11. We will see you next week, and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/register to get daily updates of all the bills that we're reporting on and all kinds of other good stuff as well. Thanks again for watching.